Today on CJ, we're going to scrap this cast iron intake. If you're looking to add some style and performance to your truck, today we're installing this Edelbrock PROFORM RPM intake and this PROFORM 650 double pumper carburetor to our 1971 F-250. This Edelbrock dual plane intake has an awesome Endurashine finish on it. It's ideal for street strip applications, which will help the power band of your engine perform. It has provisions for adding the PCV or breather flange for your application of engine. This polished PROFORM 650 carburetor is going to look great on our truck. It has electric choke and mechanical secondaries. It's constructed of lightweight aluminum, which is lighter than the stock carburetor. When setting up your carburetor, it has float level windows, so no more removing the plug to see the float level. Now let's get these parts installed on our 1971 F-250. You're going to need a good variety of tools, a torque wrench, and a gasket scraper for this installation. First part of disassembly is to drain the coolant. Now that we have the coolant emptied, we're going to remove the air cleaner to access the hoses. Now we're going to remove all our hoses connected to our intake. It's a little hard to see, but we're going to remove the hose off our carburetor spacer. I'm going to remove the spark plug wires off the spark plug and leave them on the cap. Now remove your coil wire. Flip this lever to remove your cap. Next, we're going to start removing the carburetor. First thing is remove the throttle linkage. Just push down that clip, it'll pop off, and just pull the clip out. Don't lose your clip. Remove the clip off your kickdown cable. It's a little tricky. Slide the kickdown rod off the throttle linkage. Remove the fuel line. Grab a rag, there will be a little bit of fuel coming out. Remove the vacuum line. Then remove the two thermometer tubes off the carburetor. You can remove this hose, you will not be using it anymore. You just pull out of the manifold and it'll just pull right out. Remove the throttle spring and then you can unbolt your carburetor. You got these 4 nuts. Now that the bolts are all removed, slowly pull the carburetor off. Be careful, fuel might leak out. Remove this coolant hose. Remove the breather off your valve cover to remove the throttle spacer. Remove these vacuum lines off the back of the intake. Come on. Don't do it. Don't you do it. Remove the clip off the back of the throttle linkage. Slide the throttle linkage out. Be careful of the clip. After you remove this throttle linkage, remove the other one on the firewall. Remove the plug off the back of the firewall for your sensors. Remove the coil. Before removing the distributor, I like to make a mark of where the rotor location is. Remove the bolt for the distributor hold down. Carefully pull the distributor out. I'm going to remove these 2 hose clamps and just cut the hose off. It will be easier to remove the intake with this hose not there. Before removing the intake, I like to remove all the dirt and grime so it does not get in the engine. Remove the valve covers. Whew, look at that beauty. Repeat the process on the other side. We have to remove the rocker shaft to remove the intake. You have to slowly remove all the bolts equally out so it doesn't damage the rocker shaft. Now that all the bolts are loose on the rocker shaft, pull off carefully. Remember to grab the guard under it with it. Remove the push rods. Remove the intake bolt. Repeat the process on the other side. Now that everything's removed out the intake, I'm going to take a pry bar to break the seal loose from the block. Now for the most exciting part, you get to act like Hulk and try to lift this 30-pound cast iron intake off your engine. Before installing your new intake, you have to clean all the surfaces. Remove all the old gaskets. Now that we have all the gasket material cleaned off the heads, we can install the new gaskets. What I like to do is put a little bit of RTV around the coolant ports to help it seal better. Now we're going to replace our gaskets. We have these Velcro gaskets which we carry. Repeat the process on the other side. Now the intake gasket set comes with these cork gaskets. I prefer using RTV, but you can use the cork gaskets or RTV. Alright, now we can put a bead of silicone on the front and the back side of the block. Before installing your intake, have your distributor handy to help line up your intake. Line up your hose for the water pump to your intake. Having the distributor to line up your intake really helps getting everything set up. Now install your intake bolts. You will need the Edelbrock bolt kit for the FE intake when installing this. The Edelbrock bolt kit comes with 3 different lengths of bolts. The longest ones are for the front and the middle of the intake. The medium bolt is for the 2nd and 4th hole. The short one is for the back of the intake. Now that the bolts are snugged down, it's time to torque. We're going to torque the intake down to 25 foot-pounds. Now when torquing the intake, we're going to do 3 increments. We're going to do 10, 15, then 25 foot-pounds. Once you have torqued them all down to 10 foot-pounds, then move on to 15. Now that we've torqued down the bolts to 15, we move on to 25 foot-pounds. Once you've torqued down the bolts to 25 foot-pounds, go around again to make sure all the bolts have seated correctly. Once the intake is installed, now you can install your push rods. Remember to clean the ends of the push rods before installing. While installing the push rods, remember to seat the push rod on the lifter. Now before installing your rocker rail, there's one thing you need to watch out for. This bolt here has a narrow shoulder on it to let oil flow through to oil the rocker rail. I like to add grease to the push rod and valve so that I don't get metal on metal contact. Now you can install your rocker rail. We'll be torquing our rocker rail to 45 foot-pounds, but we'll have to do it in a 3-step increment not to bend the rail. We'll be starting at 20 foot-pounds. Once you've torqued down the bolts to 20, we move up to 30 foot-pounds. Once you've torqued the bolts to 30 foot-pounds, move to 45. Once you've torqued down the bolts to 45 foot-pounds, repeat the process on the other side. Reinstall your valve covers. Now we're going to install our heater hose adapter. Now the factory carb spacer had coolant running through it. On our new setup, we will not be running it, so we're going to be plugging off the coolant adapter. Remember to orient the fitting to the right position. Install your heater hose and tighten up your clamp. Install your coolant temperature sensor. Remember to not over tighten the fitting because it is brass. Install your throttle linkage on the back of the intake. Next, we're going to install our vacuum port. The original one was on the back of the intake. With the new one, it's going to be in the front, so we'll have to lengthen our vacuum hoses. Now it's time to install our distributor. Remember that mark we made? Now let's line it up with the rotor. That went in way too easy. Install your distributor hold down. Remember not to tighten, we still have to time the engine. Now it's time to put our thermostat housing back on. Remember to put a new gasket on and orient the thermostat the right direction. Install your gasket, then the phenolic spacer. Install your last gasket, then the carburetor. Lastly, install the washers and nuts to bolt down the carburetor. When installing your stock throttle linkage on a new carburetor, you might have to work with your throttle linkage to get full throttle out of your carburetor. Remember to install the ground on the back of the intake. Install your coil, don't forget the spring bracket. Plug all your sensors back in, your distributor back in, then plug the wiring harness back into the firewall. We also installed this Mr. Gasket fuel line with built-in fuel pressure gauge. Install your upper radiator hose. Now with the new fuel line set up, we're going to take a piece of rubber hose to connect the fuel line to the new carburetor. Reinstall your EGR tube to the valve cover, then to the back of the carburetor. Install your throttle return spring. Now that we have the carburetor installed on our intake, we now have to relocate our vacuum lines from the back of the intake to the front of the intake. Now that we have the vacuum lines done, we're going to move on to the choke. We need a keyed power source for your choke. Now I'm going to run my wire to the fuse box and I'm going to find a keyed power source under the dash. Alright guys, we're at the home stretch. Now it's time to time our engine. I'm going to be timing my engine to 14 degrees. For this application, you'll need an aftermarket kickdown cable. After that, install your air cleaner and your installation is complete. Check it out guys, that Edelbrock intake looks killer on this engine with that PROFORM 650 carburetor. Looks great, but also performs great. Can't wait to see what it does on the road. This should take about 6 to 8 hours for your installation. For more great parts, go to cjponyparts.com.